When the ancient Hebrews told the story about this amazing and terrifying world that we are part of, the unfolding and the creation of this world, they included this verse in their song of creation. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Perhaps you've heard this story many times, but have you ever asked this question that one very astute biblical commentator asked? He asked, well, how exactly did God move? Did God walk? Or swim? Or did God sort of float in the air? In what way did God move upon the face of the waters? I never asked that question. But in pondering the question in my imagination, it brought me directly to this poem that I first heard read when I was in 9th grade. Perhaps you know it. It's the poem The Creation by Langston Hughes. Now, Hughes has no doubt about how God moved during the creation of the world. In Hughes's poem, it wasn't just a little moving upon the face of the waters. Listen to all the ways that God moves in this poet's imagination. Every movement has some result, some impact on what occurs. Personally, I can't but help hear the poem as anything less than a dance. I'll read some of that poem to you. And God stepped out on space, and he looked around and said, I'm lonely. I'll make me a world. Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun. And he set that sun ablazing in the heavens. And the light that was left over from making the sun God gathered it into a shining ball and flung it against the darkness, spangling the night with the moon and the stars. Then down between the darkness and the light, he hurled the world, and God said, that's good. Then God himself stepped down, and the sun was on his right hand, and the moon was on his left, and the stars were clustered about his head, and the earth was under his feet, and God walked, and where he trod, his footsteps hollowed the valleys out and bulged the mountains up. And then he stopped and looked up and saw that the earth was hot and barren, and so God stepped over to the edge of the world, and he spat out the 7 seas. He batted his eyes, and the lightnings flashed. He clapped his hands, and the thunders rolled, and the waters above the earth came down. The cooling waters came down. Then God raised his arm, and he waved his hand over the sea and over the land, and he said, bring forth, and quicker than God could drop his hand, fishes and fowls and beasts and birds swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forest and the woods, and split the air with their wings. And God said, that's good. God sat down on the side of the hill where he could think. By a deep, wide river he sat down. With his head in his hand, God thought and thought till he thought, I'll make me a man. So you know how the story goes. God scooped up some clay, and by the bank of the river, he knelt him down, and there the great God Almighty, who lit the sun and fixed it in the sky, who flung the stars to the most far corner of the night, who rounded the earth in the middle of his hand, this great God, like a mammy bending over her baby, kneeled down into the dust, toiling over a lump of clay till he shaped it in his own image, and then into it he blew the breath of life, and man and woman became a living soul. Amen. Now, that poetic version of the creation story captivates the imagination of a world that came about through a playful, ever-moving, even dancing God. The one commentator that took that question, how exactly did God move across the face of the waters? He took that question seriously. You know what he came up with? He sort of looked at that word moves in other places in the Hebrew text, and he concluded that in this context, what we translate as simply move actually means that God flutters or shakes. That's it. Nothing against fluttering or shaking, but somehow I like Langston Hughes's version much better. How about you? Now, obviously for most of us, creation stories, whether they're biblical or poetic, in contemporary poetic form, don't really matter. Most of us, we don't care whether God moved or how particularly God moved. It doesn't matter. However, how we move through life upon this earth does matter. Do we merely flutter? Or is there some determinative impact in our own movement through the measure of our days? The ongoing unfolding of this creation that we are part of may be in our hands more now than we ever realized. In a time when humans have created a world in which the earth has been wounded by our actions and there are real divisions, there are those who would even simply and sharply increase those divisions among us, where there are we who are people formed from one common clay, it does matter how we move upon the days upon this earth, our days upon this earth. We know we have inherited the results of the perspectives and actions of those who have come before us, and our actions today ripple across the generations that follow us and upon these fragile seas that feed us, that nurture our thirst for life and for beauty. Most succinctly, there are those who, such as Otto Scharmer, who talks about three ever-increasing divides that define our contemporary world. One is the eco-divide. We're coming to terms with our understanding that we continually use many more times the resources that are available on our fragile earth. And we cannot sustain that. Some of us in some parts of the globe more than others, but it impacts us all. Another divide is the social divide. More of the wealth created by the labor of the many goes to those at the top 1% of the economic ladder, leaving more and more into unnecessary poverty, dire poverty. The spiritual divide. That means that many people feel disconnected with the deeper sources of meaning that can sustain a life in times where despair can sometimes overshadow hope. We tend to move sometimes in the middle of all of these divisions, we tend to move towards greater absencing rather than presencing. Indeed, in the world that we have created, it does matter how we move through our days, not just to us, but to our common home that we share, this earth. It matters to the peoples of this earth and to the generations that hopefully will follow us. As much as we would like to absence ourselves from the world's pains and aspirations, and we do absence ourselves, can we afford To sit still when the pains around us and within us cry us to respond? Can we manage to merely flutter when our fragile earth is so wounded and the web of life is so threatened? Can we simply slump into resignation in the face of broadcasted hatred, real violence, and growing inequity and sinking despair? Yes, we can indeed sit still. Yes, we can simply slump. Yes, we can even flutter, whatever that means, if we want to. But yet, don't we know that something rises up in us again and again? Something that happens to us either alone or together, when we can hardly absence ourselves for what calls us towards greater and more presence in this world and to one another. Something rises up in us again and again that calls us forth into greater engagement rather than absencing. To be human religiously calls us to be conscious of the choices that we make each day, and to be ever more conscious of the choices that actually are limited for others because of our own complicity and complacency. Fortunately, our spirits are often strengthened by the testimony and the witness of those who throughout history have risen up again and again in the face of despair, in spite of, and maybe sometimes because of, uncertainty, in the face of human hatred, human tyranny, downright oppression, and human carelessness. Their testimony reaches to us across the ages and strengthens our spirit and emboldens our heart to rise up in some new way in the times in which we live. Just this week was the anniversary of a particular uprising in Amsterdam on February 25th, 1941, when Holland, during the Nazi terror, began to experience the deportation of Jews. A general strike was called that demanded their release. Workers across the country joined in, and the strike spread like wildfire across towns and villages in the Amsterdam region and throughout northern Holland. Major factories, the transportation system, and most public services came to a standstill in protest, in resistance, in rising up. We have the testimony of those who risked the retaliation that came 3 days later because they knew in their heart of hearts that we're all made of the same clay, that there is a sacredness within each of us that calls for dignity, not degradation. How important it was for those Dutch guardians of the human spirit to rise up, to halt life as usual in the midst of such atrocity. Their witness speaks to us across the ages, nurtures our own spirit, and emboldens our own heart. How important it is for us as people of faith to rise up in small and sometimes profound ways to embody that which we espouse so eloquently in story, in song, and in sermon. James Luther Adams, a Unitarian minister and a new professor at Meadville Theological School, a Unitarian Universalist school that exists to this day, discovered in a study trip in 1935 to Germany that many of the German churches were not resisting the rise of Nazism. In his autobiography, he asks, "What is it in my preaching and in my political action that would stop this horror, this atrocity?" He became one of the most important Unitarian Universalist theologians of the 20th century. I had the good fortune of studying with him on occasion. But this question about what is the use of all of our preaching and political action if we cannot stop this became a haunting and a grounding question throughout his long teaching and preaching career. He felt that oftentimes resistance in the face of inhumanity and atrocity may be called for us as a religious task. He became the leading exponent of the understanding of the liberal church as the prophethood of all believers. He focused not on the action of the one, the preacher, or the politician, but on the collective action of the many, a prophethood of all believers who could become a movement for prophetic action and resistance when the situation demanded it. For years, this quote by Adams has been part of my own personal scripture. He said that as part of the radical Reformation, the liberal religious tradition, we deny the immaculate conception of virtue and the necessity of social incarnation. We deny the immaculate conception of virtue and the necessity of social incarnation. Indeed, as part of the trajectory of the radical Reformation and the prophetic traditions of all religions, incarnation is not limited to one person or one time. When we stay true to the trajectory of our traditions, it's not enough to espouse virtues if somehow, some way, these do not become actually embodied, socially incarnate realities in our midst. Justice exclaimed, but not fought for, is not justice at all. Equity in human relations, only piously proclaimed, does nothing to confront the large inequities that limit the possibilities of many and heighten the advantages for the few. The human religious task of our time and all times is to enact, to embody, to bring forth forthrightly, intentionally, and faithfully that which we aspire to in our words. We live in times in which actually I'm beginning to feel this is more important than ever. To sit still, to bask in our complacency, to flutter, whatever that means, in our own feelings of overwhelmedness is not enough. We begin to see opportunities all around us where people are joining together in movements over and alongside of the organizations that we thought were there to protect us and support us and serve us. We saw that in the Occupy movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Arab Spring, all kinds of places where people are organizing together and rising up and resisting that which they can no longer stand because it wounds the human spirit. It divides us who are united by being formed of the same clay. Now, I remember yesterday in our retreat when we made a group mind map of all of the various trends that are happening in the community and around the world that could potentially call to you as a congregation in terms of your response in social justice ministries. And as we kept filling that map, it became very chaotic and overwhelming. And I remember that moment when I just had to pause and sit and wait because I could not record any more of it. How many of you were there in that moment? Remember that. Maybe you sensed some of that same feeling of overwhelmedness. So it brings me to this understanding, this essential understanding that in order to be communities of resistance, communities of hope as congregations, we need to be sure to also nurture the spiritual grounding that can sustain us and support us and motivate us to move forward. For me, that grounding comes from a firm understanding that in spite of these divisions that oftentimes are increased, that there is a radical truth that comes to us through the poets and the mystics, the religious and the prophets across all time, that it comes to us to get known again and again, and it's at the heart of all that is, that we are connected. The poet says, to see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wildfire, to hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. For me, that other grounding text comes from E.M. Forrester's book, Howard's End, when he writes, only connect. That was the whole of her sermon. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen in its height. Live in fragments no longer. In that poem by Langston Hughes, that understanding that we are shaped by the same clay, that understanding that our individual stories may be part of a larger cosmic story. That gives me that sense that we are connected in spite of the differences and the divisions that may arise in the systems that we're part of. Religion, at its root, comes from that Latin word religio, which means to bind together and to find those deeper places of connection in ourself. That deep felt and known connection can empower and sustain us through our work in social justice, through our work as religious liberals who try to be present rather than absent to the pains and the aspirations of our world. So this weekend I did have the opportunity to work with about a tenth of your congregation, a little more than a tenth of your congregation in the social justice retreat. Friday evening, all day Saturday. It's amazing to look around and see that some of you are still sitting upright, because it was a lot of work. But through the series of discussions and activities of our weekend, it became clear that there has been a gradual development in this congregation, as Aaron was saying earlier. It's displayed a little in that timeline, moving from individuals taking action to also coordinating congregational efforts, moving from this church acting alone to joining in partnership with others in the community, including other faith communities, moving to the role of doing good alone, to also recognizing how one's own privilege might be a hindrance to a true understanding of what helping and empowering can mean. Something amazing is happening already here in the story of your social justice ministries. You are becoming and honing a community of hope and of resistance. And something wants to emerge here as well. Something that you are beginning to engage in and hone and cultivate in ways that the imagination itself cannot simply hold. Hope is a daily task. It's something that we have to do in the simplest ways as well as the most profound ways as individuals and collectively. In that poem, Hope, an Owner's Manual, that Carlo read, there were those verses, in the worst of times, you will have to pass it off, park it, fly by the seat of your pants with nothing in the bank. You'll still want to take the express, tiptoe past the dogs of the apocalypse that are sleeping in the shade of your future. Pay at the window, pass your hope like a bad check. You might still have just enough time to make a deposit. Let's continue to deposit hope in each other's lives. Let's continue to deposit hope in the lives of those who are suffering and aspiring for more in the world around us. Let's kindle again and again the fire of commitment that can inspire us, capture our passion, and enable us to move forward with faith and with hope. So may it be.